you want to put it in its most simplest form, a negotiation between China, BlackRock, and JP Morgan. That's what I think this war is. The nuclear bomb was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That has directly led to the renegotiation of 50 of the most important energy, minerals, food components. We are categorically going through a global reset.
1981 to the present, the valuation of the market, not the price, the valuation, which should not trend, is up a compounded 4% a year for 45 years. What happens when it compounds negative 4% for 45 years? The private credit market game is over.
In Dubai, they started selling their gold, rotating it into Bitcoin, so that they could then go on the plane and leave. This is the final war, the reset of all.
Simon Dixon is back, and this time alongside Professor Dave Collum to give us a full update on the Iran war, exactly how it's impacting markets right now, and where we are in the transition phase to the new multipolar world. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. Very excited to have this conversation, to get you guys together to kind of share your knowledge and insight and kind of pull apart what exactly is going on in the Iran conflict. Now, there has been a ton of changes, Simon, since last time we spoke about 2 weeks ago. You gave a beautiful kind of framework, and I'll cover it here quickly. But since then, like, we've seen serious escalations with oil and gas refineries being hit in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, in Israel as well, too. Last night, I was watching in preparation, the precious metals markets were just getting taken out at the knees. We had that 48-hour warning to open up the Strait of Hormuz, which Trump has seemingly completely backed off today. We're recording this Monday morning, as well as I'm seeing Zero Hedge reporting that they're going to have like joint control over the area. Things seem to have escalated, but then they've kind of backed off. The markets are going crazy. So, Simon, last time you laid out this idea that what we're witnessing is it's not Israel and the U.S. versus Iran. This is the financial industrial complex versus the military industrial complex, that we're seeing basically the transnational capital using the U.S. military to kind of go in and get rid of the IRGC hardliners, kind of strategically weaken Israel, as well as get the U.S. bases out of the region to kind of set up the Gulf Coast area to actually be open up to markets, to actually maybe get some stability in that region of the world as well, too. And you'd also pinpointed it was the April summit, the April China summit, that we might even see the basically proposal of what the things are going to look like going forward at that point in time. So there's a ton of information compressed in there. Can you give us a little bit, if I've missed anything in terms of the framework, please correct me there and give me an update. Where are we? What do you see going on right now with the Iran conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to recognize is that this isn't definitely not the scale of the 12-day war. So the 12-day war had a theatrical element to it. There was a tit for tat. There was an escalation cycle. And we had certain IRGC hardliners decapitated through decapitation campaigns. And then we had Israel that was burdened up with debt, ran out of munitions, and it ended with a Hollywood movie where Trump comes along and says, here's the B-2 bombers. We have eliminated and eradicated the Iran nuclear program. Therefore, we don't need to do this anymore. And so there was an off-ramps. I believe that the negotiations that we're allegedly on off, and everyone's debating right now, that are manipulating the markets like crazy, have already been a 5-year negotiation between China, which is effectively the rising power, and America, that is being shrunk into a regional power and going through an asset stripping exercise by what I call the financial industrial complex. Now, in order to achieve that, you have the old world order, which is represented by the US being the military industrial complex. Now, they benefited from strategic tension and forever wars in the Middle East because they were able to print money and then send it over to come back and purchase weapons. And then you could use that to create the demand for dollars through the petrodollar. And then you would continually have that money being lent back into the bond market. That order is effectively over. And so there is a financial operation and a legacy military that still wants to hold on to their version of the world. That's represented by Israel. That's represented by a model of always having and funding militias across the region. and that's represented by strategic tension between Iran and Israel. Once you remove death to America, death to Israel, the need for Israel diminishes, and Israel has an identity crisis because they were always creating the justification for war. And so this is effectively a war to end that narrative, is what I think is happening here. But at the same time, we are categorically going through a global reset. I'll just jump into that right now, because effectively the nuclear bomb was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That has directly led to the renegotiation of 50 of the most important energy, minerals, food components. And every single one of those is being renegotiated and giving winners and losers as a result of it. And that is a global reset. Right now, if the Strait of Hormuz opened today, it would take probably a month to get through the 3,500 ships that are just sat there trying to figure out what to do. The damaged infrastructure was probably 5 months of damage, but if it escalates to the next stage, Qatar has already come out and said 5 years of damage to bring that back on tap. And so what we have effectively done is we have reset the world order to make Europe and the Western Hemisphere dependent upon American liquefied natural gas and oil. And at the same time, draw Asia and Russia closer through these energy bailouts right now. There is only two ways in which this goes. And I believe that if we are still in the old world order and the military industrial complex is still trying to prop up the dollar and the petrodollar, then what would happen next is you'd have 600,000 troops invading Iran. It would take years. They would take over the oil fields, and they would rip open, this oil in Iran is all going to be priced in dollar, and the Strait of Hormuz is going to be controlled by BlackRock and other financial powers. That's impossible. It's not going to happen. And so therefore, the only other alternative is that you actually end up in a deal that effectively vassalizes Iran deeper into China. And this financial industrial complex, they try to get a foothold across the Middle East, but they commit to a regional stability model rather than the forever war. So effectively, it ends the forever war. And we're going through massive market manipulation right now in order to get to a scenario where the only choice is to do a deal. That's a lot covered.
That's a ton covered there. Dave, I'm curious your thoughts on that. If you have any questions or pushback on what Simon just laid out.
Actually, it sounded pretty good to me. Financial industrial complex and military industrial complex strike me as a vaguely differentiated group. Can you clarify that? Because I would put the two together, but you might be talking about U.S. versus London or something, So I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's transnational in nature, and the military industrial complex is somewhat more nationalistic to America. So because America built its empire on the manufacturing base, and then it used that in order to prop up the dollar through endless wars globally. Mm-hmm. And then you could regime change, you could overthrow dictators, you could replace democracies with dictators, you could destroy currencies, you could do currency wars, all sorts of stuff, in order to enforce the extraction of a country's resources, the money being spent back into a different agreement with US. And the military is effectively a for-rent militia, I think of it as, for US corporate interests. So if you need some oil, you go get the military to go get it. If you need some rare earth minerals, you go get the military to go get it. And through lobbying, corporate power controls like the West and America. Now, this military is very much nationalistic and aligned with America being the global hegemon. Transnational capital is indifferent between London, America, multipolarity, anything. And in effect, because in 1971, when America came off the gold standard and we entered into effectively everything being financialized, securitized, and we entered into globalization where China built the manufacturing base, transnational capital effectively became the largest asset managers in the world, like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. The largest, and across multi organizations, the largest investment banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, the creators of the dollar, of the pound, of the euro, and just this entire central banking, private equity, Silicon Valley type of complex. It's completely transnational because it partnered with all the global sovereign wealth funds, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, Singapore, Norway, and then it also had to partner with the largest pools of surplus capital, which was China and various other things. So transnational capital is indifferent. It's not nationalistic in any way, whereas the military is kind of propped up by ideologies like Israel and Zionism, funding militia and making sure terrorism is always happening, and that type of nationalistic thing. It's also represented by neocon evangelical Christians that prop up the narrative that kind of fuels the war and the fake war on terror and believing that communism is always a threat and all those different, creating a new boogeyman for the next Hitler, but always making sure that the resources come back into the US stock market.
So I would have thought, for example, that when Trump got into office for the second time, there was a win-win relationship that that Trump could say to Putin, I want this to end quickly in Ukraine. And I want bilateral trade agreements between Russia and the United States. And Putin would say, I want this land. And since Trump doesn't give a damn about where the borders are over there, he'd say, sure. And they would have cut a deal. And what struck me is what stood in the way of that was Europe. Is that correct? Is that a reasonable model?
I see it differently to that. I think that is the mainstream narrative that Trump wants to create peace and Europe is getting in the way of war. When you actually follow how the main military industrial complex, it consists of by far and away US stocks, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Boeing, Palantir. But there's some legacy MIC in the British companies, BAE system. There's a big area in Israel, and then you've got Germany and France. Those countries host private corporations that always benefit from every single war. And so what I think happened is Trump is way more aligned with the financial industrial complex, BlackRock, those banks, he's very transactional. Biden was a traditional neocon aligned with the military industrial complex. And so because transnational capital, which is the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, China, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, they wanted to move this world to multipolarity because they started to see the returns in America diminish. And they wanted to build little financial centers all around the world to hedge against this concentration within Europe and America. And so when they want, when you want to create regional stability in the Middle East and end the forever war, you need to give the military industrial complex compensation. And the only compensation that you can give it, if America effectively is becoming a regional hegemon rather than global hegemon, is you need to give it Central and South America and Europe. And so Trump doesn't want to end the war because the military need to make up for lost profits if this is the final war in the Middle East. And so whenever you end a war, you have to set the parameter for the next war. And so immediately what he did is if we're going to have any breakage in the petrodollar and the forever war here, then he created a narrative of, I want to end the war, but I need to blame it on Putin and I need to blame it on Zelensky. So Zelensky had the humiliation ritual. But Putin is going to get Ukraine. and BlackRock is going to get, the rest of the minerals when the final negotiation happens. But the military needs at least another 3 years and $1 trillion out of that war. And so Trump created a narrative, and he re-said, right, NATO, we're going to get you to sell a lot more weapons by let's have this war for another 3 years or so. And you're going to pay for it. And all the money through the euro dollar is going to go back into the US stock market. And we'll print another $1.5 trillion in order to get a massive military budget. But the Russian war must continue. And there must be a constant threat in Europe that Putin is the next Hitler and he's going to take it over. So they constructed that narrative, made it look like Trump wants to end it and Europe is the enemy. And now you've got strategic tension across Europe using Russia in order to make up for lost profits in the Middle East. That's how I see it. So
I didn't think that Putin was an expansionist story was very compelling. It always struck me as a very bad narrative, and I kind of figured that few of any importance bought that narrative. That was just a clickbait narrative that Putin would expand and the Soviet Union would expand, and that always struck me as crap. And at one point, Putin said, why would we invade Europe? You think we're nuts? And I think that's a pretty reasonable view of Russia's stance. I never quite understood that narrative as one that could lead anywhere, because it always struck me as sort of Twitter level logic, not any higher than that. I did talk to a military intelligence guy from another country who said that this Ukraine war is going to go on for years, and that shocked me a little.
Yeah,
I thought we'd be finding a way to wrap it, but that's not consistent with your model of the world. Let me ask you this. It seems as though there was a shift that you could see, and I've never quite understood this, where at one point the dark lord of it all was Goldman, and all of a sudden BlackRock takes it over. What was that power shift? What was that about?
Yeah, so look, Goldman is definitely powerful. JP Morgan is the most important investment bank because they're also a retail bank. They get to create the dollar, they get to financialize, securitize, and they have an asset management. But BlackRock and JP Morgan were effectively the net winners of the 2008 global financial crisis. BlackRock got Barclays iShares, which was the ETF division in UK and Europe. And ETF has become the new currency war. So if you want to control corporate interest, then because the markets are so disjointed from reality now, one way of doing it is you need to have the money printer. That's what affects the share price right now. So always having the money printer go. The second is ETF inflows. And so now everybody is contributing. They're not picking individual stocks. They're just giving BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard their money. And so you go figure out what the 500 best stocks are. And
right. You've got so the passive investing model, yeah.
Yes. So the passive investing model, BlackRock was effectively the one that was able to acquire all those assets in the 2008 financial crisis. And effectively their software, Aladdin, has been used by both the Fed in the 2008 global financial crisis, most central banks that are members of the Bank for International Settlements, most pension funds and money managers, and also during COVID, it was used by Treasury in order to allocate capital. BlackRock effectively built the best software, the best AI, and it got global penetration in order to push out data to all the largest pools of capital in the world. But obviously, JP Morgan is still involved in the bringing these new companies to market, financialization, securitization, and the banker of all the black op operations and deep state operations as well. So they are both above government, but both BlackRock and JP Morgan have kind of hit the center stage. And now BlackRock's got approximately $12.5 trillion of assets. So it can move capital, it can control, it's got 20,000 board seats, and it's got the AI and data feed that all the central banks and money managers are reliant upon.
So the other reset that maybe I'm being quaint and old-fashioned, but I have this deep-seated belief that markets have a way of wrestling free of control, and that as you say, the markets are all completely insane. Very few people put numbers on them. The number I put on it, for example, just take the S&P 500, which is the generic 401k white bread investment. I have it at 200% over historical average valuation, which means it can stay up there, but now you have to adjust your thinking as to how much you will get going forward. If you buy a Toyota Camry, it's a good car, but if you pay $150K for it, it's not a good deal. And so I have this belief that there's got to be a reset, and I'm not sure there's one reset, but there's got to be a reset that gets rid of all the fictional profit, gets rid of all the fictional capital, which is really just pixels on a screen and doesn't represent real wealth. And maybe I'm just thinking like an old man, but it seems to me that there's no case in history where a market got way overvalued that didn't eventually find its way back to cheap. Doesn't mean it'll be fast. In fact, the worst case for me is if it's slow. The worst case for me, to use a historical precedent, would be like the Nikkei, where I was listening to George Noble the other day. George and I were on a Twitter Spaces, actually. He invited me on a Twitter Spaces. It's like, holy moly, what are you doing, George? And I said, I think our markets will become uninvestable, much the way the Nikkei was uninvestable starting in '89. And he said, well, you could short it. And I didn't know that he actually made money shorting it. I didn't know that at the time. But I said, it took 20 years to find a bottom. That's not, you want something that cliff dives, right? Short sellers love it when it cliff dives. The Nikkei, there were opportunities, but you could also go broke trying to short the Nikkei too during that 20-year period, because it just kept shaking you out of your position. And that to me is the worst case scenario, because I'm going to be in my grave before I'm offered a buying opportunity to get back in that game. And I did notice that although this morning started out bleak, my metals are finally pseudo behaving, although gold's not, but silver is up. Silver, apparently someone pounded the shit out of it a minute ago because it was way up there. Yeah. These things are like, give them some Ritalin or something, holy moly. But something's got to break. This is teenagers driving on black ice. They're fishtailing there. At some point, someone's going to drive this sucker off the road.
So, your thoughts?
I agree. There's a lot to cover there. So effectively, the distortion is money printing. Obviously, America has to print. The dichotomy that America is in right now is, if you look at the average cost on its, what are we at now? Almost $40 trillion of debt.
Right, 39.
It's 39.
Yeah, and that's today.
Yeah.
And we'll be.
I'll tell you, they're going to get me to buy Bitcoin eventually.
Yes, they will.
This gold silver movement. I'm thinking of buying Beanie Babies. Yeah.
So the average cost of the debt is 3.3%, and the reason that Trump always has to tackle on these big moves is he did it firstly during the tariff trade war, where the bond market and the 10-year yield, which really is driving the mortgages, credit card debt, auto loans.
It can't be driving credit card debt that much, because the credit card debt has a 22% buffer. So the 10-year can move around a lot, and the credit cards don't. I don't think they give a damn. They're just gonna gut you like a fish.
True. So, the mortgages then.
Mortgages, yeah.
They got a bit of a margin there to play with.
Just a little bit. There might be a reason why it has to be that big, like people don't pay, things like that. But that's a healthy profit margin on the surface.
Yeah. So now the same is happening right now. So since there was, we had effectively after tariffs, we had the strategic weakening of the dollar, and the trade was most foreign currencies represented by DXY, gold, silver, they were outperforming the dollar. We had this big shift, that massive move into gold. And the dollar was effectively being weakened on the premise that it needs to rebuild the manufacturing base and, that type of thing. When the bond market said no, he had to taco. We had all these different agreements and announcements and market manipulations and all that type of stuff. But we're getting the same now with the Iran war, because the Iran war, as soon as it started, the dollar started strengthening again. The 10-year, 30-year, 20-year yields all started going up. And the issue is that America has to, in order to keep the scheme alive, America's growth rate has to be greater than the average interest on the debt. Otherwise,
good luck with that one.
Exactly. So you've got to be above 3.3%. So what are the things you can do? Well, you can regime change the Federal Reserve and force them to put short-term rates down and roll it all over on the shorter.
But then they just put in Warsh, which makes no sense based on that model.
Yeah, unless you want the world to think that he's hawkish and then he does it.
Right. So he either has to be a pathological liar for 15 years.
Yeah.
Right. Or I still think it's possible they're teeing up the great financial reset with Warsh. Warsh, they said, you're going to be the next Volcker, dude. You are going to ride the sucker to the basement because you're the only one who's shown any balls. And so
yeah,
that's my best model. I don't think Warsh has been lying for 15 years. I think he believes what he's been saying.
Very possible. And I think it's consistent with the financial industrial complex, like hedging to this new model where foreign currencies outperform the dollar and US foreign capital markets outperform the S&P. The only thing is that this war changed all those trends. There was a flight to dollar. The dollar started strengthening again. The S&P became the most stable stock market of all the markets. And so I believe that once this comes to an end, and there has to be a deal, because right now, the longer term rates are going up. That makes it problematic. If we're headed into a
recession, is the Fed afraid to drop rates for fear that they will look completely feckless if they do and the rates keep going up? Are they holding back because they're afraid that they will be shown to be not in charge anymore?
Well, before Simon jumps in there, I'd say that that's kind of my position, in the sense that they lost so much credibility over COVID and they're still recovering from that reputational damage, that they're giving no forward guidance. They're giving themselves as much slack as possible. They're making very little moves. And I think that specter kind of rests on their shoulder, but I'm probably wrong. Simon, your thoughts?
No, yeah. So we are definitely in fiscal dominance, where treasury policy and Fed policy becomes less useful. And you have to just print as much as you can. There's only a big print at the end of this. We've already had this war. If the Strait opens today, it already is the global reset.
CoinKite has been in the game for years, creating hands down the best and most secure hardware when it comes to securing your Bitcoin. The Cold Card Q is an absolute powerhouse and my daily driver, and it's ideal for newcomers and advanced users alike. The Tap Signer gives you a low-cost, user-friendly option for those just getting started or for convenience when traveling. You can head to coinkite.com and use code BTC Sessions for discounts, or simply scan the QR code on the screen to get started right away. One company I like pointing people to when they ask about Bitcoin mining is Abundant Mines. They were founded by Bo and Christine Turner after losing over $500,000 to broken promises in the mining industry. And they built their hosting model to remove the usual headaches. With Abundant Mines, you own your machines and keep 100% of the Bitcoin you mine. There's no revenue share, no hidden skims. Pricing is simple. One flat monthly fee covers power, parts, labor, and repairs. They also guarantee uptime. If a machine goes down, their hash rate redirect system routes hash power from their fleet, so earnings don't just stop. And every machine is insured at full replacement value. Everything is hosted in the US, powered by Hydro, and mining equipment may qualify for 100% year one bonus depreciation. Learn more at abundantmines.com/sessions.
So let's clarify print. This gets to me too. Let me give you my Twitter level financial analysis, which you can tell is becoming a pejorative term. To me, you create money by creating debt. And so the idea of printing your way out, short of just real life printing, real life just creating money from zero, from whole cloth, which they're not averse to doing, you end up creating more debt to quench the debt. And so that doesn't work for me. And so then you say, okay, so there's some QE variant here, in which you create money from thin air. But if we start seeing inflation, I think the Fed is going to feel incredibly cornered and say, no, I mean, we already have inflation, right? You got to be an idiot to think that the inflation is tame. But although it could become deflation so fast that, right? But I think the Fed, I think the Fed will be cornered if all of a sudden headline inflation takes off, if the price of lumber shoots up fivefold again, and that sort of thing. I think the Fed will go, we can't lower rates. We can't create that's money spigot. Tell me about that.
Yeah, they've kind of got because they got the dual mandate, they got inflation plus unemployment. That we are at what I think is just, the end of
no win.
You can't do it. There is no win. There's only narrative at this point. So, you can put down the short-term rates and probably the long-term rates are going to spike because no one believes it. So now you've got to roll over everything on the short term and you've got to find
what Yellen did already.
Yeah.
Right.
The difference here is that, the deficit as a percentage of GDP is at 6% now. That has never happened since in Volcker. I think it was about 2% or something. Mm-hmm. That sounds like
and it was a better read on the GDP too.
Yes, absolutely. And the last time we were here was World War II. That was the last time we got to these levels.
Well, the good news is we might be at World War III. So
I personally believe that there's no option of World War III and greater powers are negotiating a deal.
Right.
And I think Trump was installed to create.
Do those greater powers include Iran?
Iran right now holds the key to the price of oil. And who is Iran? Iran effectively is an economic dependent upon China right now. And so Iran is selling 90% of its oil to China. The Strait of Hormuz is open to China. And at the moment, if China is involved in a big negotiation, it is a relationship between Iran and China right now that has maximum leverage. So Trump needs to crash the price of oil. Otherwise, things are going to start breaking. And we can look.
I just don't see how you crash the price of oil today. That just seems to me the price of oil has been hanging on by its nails, not to go up, not down.
Yeah. But there is only one way to crash the price of oil. It's to reach a deal with Iran. And to reach a deal with Iran, you are negotiating with a greater power, which is China. And in April, they're due to meet, but that meeting may or may not be delayed. We don't know what to trust anymore. But to me, this is the final war, the reset of all 50, oil and LNG and different fertilizers and minerals. All of those are being renegotiated right now to move to this world of multipolarity. And I don't think Trump's trying to save the dollar. I think he's an agent of chaos that is effectively going to have to reach a deal because right now there are two matrix. You've got the price of oil. At this price of oil, if it stays here for another 2 weeks, what are the key stress points we can see right now? Well, we've got if you look at most of America's growth last year, it was a function of building out all the data centers, AI, all of the energy that went there, the input functions.
See, I don't call that even growth, to be old school.
Yeah.
To me, that's like you build a gas station, right? It's not growth until you start creating revenues, right? You haven't made a penny building that gas station. That's an upfront sunken cost. And to me, the AI growth is all upfront sunken costs. And they haven't yet convinced me they know how to actually turn it into wealth creation through presumably efficiency, through presumably firing us all.
Exactly.
Listen,
And that is
what about the possibility? What about the possibility that they're creating a technate, to use a technocracy? They're producing a technate that's basically the Middle East. Does that fit into your world, or is the technate of the Middle East a sub-technate of something bigger?
Well, the Middle East effectively is this, the Gulf countries that are impacted, mainly UAE. Mm-hmm. Some of them were hedged. So if you look, firstly, China knew all this was going to happen. They were prepared for it. They built the largest oil reserves. They were preparing this for a long, long time. But what did the damage has been inflicted? What is actually happening? So Iran is taking out all of the US bases. So they're targeting all the US bases.
I believe I saw 13 so far. I could be wrong on that number. I think I saw 13 bases hit.
Yeah.
So let's go to that. There's two ends. There's two polar opposite views of that. There's the claim that we're kicking the crap out of Iran, and then there's the polar opposite claim that Iran's been throwing water balloons at Israel and bleeding them of all their fancy tech, and then they're going to throw the good stuff at them and be able to pound them mercilessly. Where do you come down on those two extreme views?
I believe that there's a level. So Iran is not, I covered this in the last one. Iran is not a monolith. There are factions of power within Iran. There's the IRGC. There's the reformist government. The reformist government is who's aligned with China. And there are IRGC, which are more pragmatic. And there is IRGC that has vested interest in continuing this war and fighting till the end, no matter what.
The crazies.
Well, they see themselves as resistance against imperial power. On the other side, in Western, they're Islamist terrorists, and you can take whichever cartoon character.
Well, there's no question that you're a freedom fighter if it's your team, and you're a terrorist if it's their team. So that's been true forever.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And neither of them are actually true. There is a series of self-interest, and within Iran, there is an economy within an economy. The IRGC controls the banking sector. Because the economy was sanctioned, IRGC built all these alternative routes for weapons trafficking, various other things. And so the IRGC has effectively a big infrastructure with private interest within that benefit from this continual strategic tension between Iran and Israel, where they never blow each other up, but they always are a couple of weeks away from a nuke. And Iran gets to say they're trying to kill us because we're Jewish. That strategic tension has built an industry that has self-interest.
Is this kayfabe? Are they knowingly not destroying each other?
I personally believe that if you look at Iran-Contra affair, which was declassified by the CIA, you could see the exact routes between Iran, Israel, and US all working together, laundering via Credit Suisse and funding the drug trafficking CIA operations in Nicaragua. And you can see that whole operation in 1980s. And then obviously Saddam Hussein was a US ally. Then they were put to war. America gave the chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein, and you create those strategic tension. I believe every single war across the Middle East is strategic tension engineered in order to prop up the petrodollar and ensure that the Middle East could never unify and partner with China and eastwards.
Well, that's been my model of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East: is never let anything get strong, right? Just make sure you kneecap every country as soon as they start getting in any way stable, with the exception of, oddly, Saudi Arabia, who somehow has been on some special list of don't touch. But they may no longer be on that list.
Well,
right?
if you look at the history of Saudi, so originally they didn't want to build their oil with the British Empire. They didn't trust the Brits, so they built it.
I'm shocked.
So they built it with the Americans, but there was always this imperial project with Israel, and therefore you had British Petroleum. They did all the covert wars with Iran. CIA, MI6 overthrew the government, got rid of the democracy, and continually installed the Shah and made sure that Iran's oil was used for British petroleum. And then obviously when they tried to nationalize the oil, you had the revolution, then you had Iran-Contra affair. Now on Saudi's side, Saudi didn't want to work with the Brits, so they partnered with the Americans. We had what later became known as Saudi Aramco. When there was a war, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Saudi and King Faisal came back and created the exact same crisis that we're having today. They effectively did an oil blockade. The price of oil went through the roof. That broke.
I remember that vividly.
Yeah. Then we had the stagflation that followed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there were a few things that happened after that. There was the assassination of King Faisal, and George Bush created a covert operation called Safari Club. And that Safari Club was essentially an intelligence network. And after regime changing Saudi, there was a lot of the more pro-intelligence operations and that partnership between Saudi. Now they built a lot of the more radical stuff, like what they call today the Islamist terrorist. They built a lot of these training camps. America was paying for it. Saudi intelligence, CIA, and Mossad were connected. I believe that they were the engineers of 9/11.
Right.
And they took down the towers, and then you had the clean break memo, the 7 wars. But Saudi over time.
So who do you think knew? I'm going to take us right down to Twitter level again. Who do you think knew 9/11 was coming? I presume the U.S. and Israel did.
U.S., Israel, and Saudi intelligence, deep state.
Those are the big three.
Yes.
While the Israelis danced.
Yeah, it was, and that they're all over the Trump administration now. Like if you look at, so the organization, I'll link, remind me, Nathan, to link to the blog where I can give a documentary on this stuff. But there was that Safari Club creation. The Mossad part was Urban Movers, which was a Mossad op in America that actually got arrested. You had the dancing Israelis. They were detained for 9 months. And if you look through the flow of money in the FBI declassified documents, one of the loans to Urban Movers, which is the one that placed the bombs and was, at the bottom and was connected to Mossad and the Mossad op and the dancing Israelis. One of the loans, if you look at it, came from Steve Witkoff. And so Steve Witkoff is a deep connection. And obviously, you also look at Cantor Fitzgerald was the expected institution that profited from all the options trading and shorting the market. That's not been confirmed, but they've never released. They declassified that. And Howard Lutnick and Larry Silverstein were the two that were the lucky people
who didn't go to work. Yeah,
didn't go to work that day.
I have this
had the insurance policy as well.
Yeah, both towers, right? I have this theory. It's just maybe I'm looking for a trace of humanity in Lutnick. I think that might be a fool's errand, but that maybe Lutnick was told don't go to New York that day without telling him why. Or do you think he flat out knew and let his entire company get fried?
I think the jury's out on that one. His brother was killed in that.
So that would be a tough argument. It'd be tough to argue that he let his brother get killed.
I think so. You'd have to believe that there is the highest level of blackmail and degeneracy or something that is incomprehensible to the human mind. But
so if you put it that way, it makes total sense.
Yeah, exactly. And he was in the Epstein files all over it. So
yeah. I was on a podcast with Nick Bryan, a Zoom call, and he said, I just did some like lightning round questions with him. And one, I said, I've got Lutnick dead to rights, right? And he said, oh, absolutely. He's absolutely, the Epstein files are not ambiguous. I knew it because I've been seeing the emails, but he's still in the White House, right? He should be bouncing down the road like a golf ball, but
yeah, but I find it hard to say that I could definitely categorically say that he knew. But he knew not to go to work. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and basically the Saudi relationship, obviously after the blockade, after the stagflation, after the Safari Club, then we had the signing of the Petrodollar. And the petrodollar effectively meant that Saudi would keep buying US treasuries, lend it to the US government. That would create the demand for the dollars. And by this time, we'd already gone off the gold standard in the Nixon shock, 71. And so now we had effectively, this relationship. Now, what changed during Trump administration in this relationship is America, through fracking, became an energy exporter. And so now America competes with Saudi, competes with the Gulf countries. And so you now have this very, very changing environment. So what was Saudi doing? What were all of the Gulf countries doing? Well, they were selling their oil to the rising manufacturing base, which was China. And so now China was buying oil from Iran, oil from Gulf, oil from LNG from Qatar, and effectively became the primary financier of the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. So what did the Gulf sovereign wealth funds do? Well, they effectively said, we're not going to buy your treasuries anymore. If you remember, during the Biden tried to get Saudi to flood the market with oil, and famously Saudi partnered with Putin because he was upset that Biden didn't help him with the Houthis and various things. But they started buying US equity instead. Now, this comes to the current markets. So Saudi's not really buying. There is not much of a petrodollar anymore. There is a petro yuan on the Chinese side. But the petrodollar, everything's being priced in dollars. And the vast majority of the world are settling in dollars. But they're not buying treasuries with those dollars because now they're buying gold and they're buying US equities. And so if you look, what was the growth? What was the AI trade? It relied upon two sources of funding. One was the private credit market, by the financial industrial complex, basically lending by putting together these packaged products. Those are the ones that are blowing up right now and getting mass withdrawals. But it was also transnational capital. It was Gulf sovereign foreign direct investment. And so they were buying up the AI infrastructure, doing deals with NVIDIA and saying, you build the data centers here, we'll plug our energy in. And so effectively, America was being asset stripped of all of its innovation. They weren't buying the treasuries, they were buying gold instead. And as the dollar started weakening, they needed to protect the peg. How are they going to protect the peg? Well, they had to just sell their treasuries, and they're not going to sell their gold. But the less, if they run out of treasuries, they're now protecting the peg to the dollar by selling gold, which is obviously not a trade that's going to last forever. So you need to reset that relationship. One way of doing it is get Iran to blow up all the US foreign bases. You get America and Israel to take out some of the hardliners, turn it into a government that would work with China's vision of the world. China has leverage over Iran, all the Gulf countries, and America, because America's running out of weapons. If it wants to build those weapons, China could just say, no, we're not exporting. So they are the American military industrial complex is dependent upon China in this relationship, which is why I can only conclude that people are negotiating, talking, and this is leading up to a big deal between the powers within America, which are military, financial, and technical, and China. And Saudi is going to probably renegotiate defense contracts. And immediately what happened? As soon as Iran started hitting those strategic targets, then they started targeting the energy infrastructure, pushed up the price of oil, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, every single relationship renegotiated. Even countries like Qatar, very interestingly, they did force majeure, turned off their LNG plants, but they're a 70% owner in Golden Path in Texas, which is 70% owned by Qatar and 30% owned by Exxon. And so they're somewhat hedged, but UAE wasn't hedged. But all of this distress selling that's happening in UAE, institutions are buying up right now. So effectively, what the financial industrial complex is doing is getting a foothold in this new multipolar world order. Trump is delivering the set of circumstances to renegotiate these contracts. And then eventually, I believe there will be a regionally stable Middle East, because it will no longer be the Middle East. The reason it was called the Middle East is because London was looking eastward and saying this is the middle of the world. It's now going to be West Asia again, because it's all renegotiated with China. And Trump, via Israel, is just trying to give as much leverage to the banks and financial institutions to get as big a foothold in this new world as effectively the Middle East control the future of the dollar.
Before you jump in there, Dave, I just have a quick question. The the LNG plants, the oil and gas infrastructure that was hit by Iran, was that intentional, or was that the military industrial complex taking shots at the financial industrial complex? Was that part of the plan, or how do you read that particular event?
I believe there is a power struggle and there was a plan, and there are factions of the military that are fighting against that plan, represented by, neocons within America, Zionists within Israel, and hardliners within the IRGC. And so I think they are genuinely resisting this. And there is a theatrical agreed upon outcome that has spiraled out of control. But in the end, I think the financial industrial complex will get what they want. And the military, just like it was in Venezuela, is being sent on these missions for transnational capital to go and get it done, what it needs to be done to transition to this new world.
See, I thought the 12-day war, which I don't even quite understand this name because I don't remember it lasting 12 days, was all theatrics. In fact, the way I looked at it was Team Trump reached out to Team Iran and said, we're going to pretend to destroy your nuclear facility, which if the Iranians are as smart as I believe they are, there's no way you can bomb them into oblivion because they're going to be way underground. If they're really important, they're not going to be sitting in a Quonset hut. And then Iran said, well, we're going to bomb an irrelevant air base, and they agreed that no one would die of any consequence. And then we'd be able to say to Israel, now shut the fuck up. And that to me was the theatrics. I thought it was brilliant theatrics using a simple model.
Yeah, no, completely agree. I agree with that. People don't like referring to theatrics because people die and things go wrong and stuff like that.
But it is theatrics.
But it is theatrics, and it ended with the Qatar operation, and then Iran went after Qatar, and then Qatar didn't retaliate, and then Netanyahu had to apologize to Qatar, and Trump brokered that, and they had a three-way victory narrative. But in the end of this, the answer, the question you originally asked is US kicking ass or is Iran kicking ass? I believe this ends with, and this could go wrong, but I believe there is a deliberate attempt, and it seems on track. At the end of this, the US will have a completely weakened presence that will be renegotiated along with China and Russia and the Gulf countries. Iran will have a country that is going to be subjected to sanction relief and opened up in mainly China's conditions. And there probably will be a joint security force with the Strait of Hormuz. There will be a Palestinian state, and there will be normalization between Iran and the GCC. And I think they have, to some degree, which people find hard to believe, agreed what targets are being taken out. But there's hardliners that are going a bit further. Like, I don't think anyone agreed to kill the children at the Iranian school. Like, I think
what do you think happened there? Was that an AI fuck up, as some say, or what do you think happened there?
I believe there are factions of power that are engaging in false flags to derail this. One of those is, hardliner radicals in Israel. Mm-hmm. The other is Russia really benefits from this,
but Israel didn't benefit from that at all because it looks like a consequence of Israel's bad behavior, right? I think.
Well, it was America.
No, I know, but the extent that, I mean, at least the average joker like me thinks that Israel dragged us into it, and therefore, when something bad happens, you can point back to Israel. I have this faith that wars have this ability to to change course on you abruptly, and that once it goes kinetic, that the best laid plans. I have a friend who was a lieutenant colonel, and he said, you get these directions, this, take Hill 521. And it says right at the top, take Hill 521. And he said the reason it's there is so that when you're in the middle and you're shooting in every imaginable direction, you go back to the top, you say, what did we plan on doing? Don't lose sight of the fact that Hill 521 was our goal, that sort of thing. But I have trouble picturing what we'll call, I guess, the hardliners of Iran not wanting to destroy Israel. And therefore, if I could easily imagine those guys saying, look, we're going to take out the 7 desalination plants.
Yeah. I don't think Iran would ever do anything as extreme as such an extreme attack on civilians. I know we're led to believe that they would.
I recognize that we have propaganda too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we did have the Iranian desalination plants hit, but it was in a managed way because it didn't create full water insecurity. But if you hit Israel's water desalination or the Gulf's, it's
catastrophic,
full-blown civilian target, disastrous humanitarian crisis. I'm hoping that doesn't happen, and I don't believe it is meant to happen. But I do believe there are several factions that can derail this. There's always private interest from those that benefit from the current setup that don't want to transition. Russia is significantly benefiting from this situation. So although they are aligned with China and they're aligned with Iran, they are getting, a significant windfall out of this, and that might have been agreed. And so that it might be, you might want to use false flags to push it a bit further. And I do believe that America is meant to end this saying it was Israel's fault. This wasn't our war. Trump got blackmailed. He was Epsteined. I think that's a construct of how the average American is meant to feel.
Right, but Trump wouldn't. Trump's enough of an. I always, to underestimate Trump is a big mistake. He should not be taken literally, but you got to take him seriously. And I have trouble picturing him falling on his sword by playing along with some plot that requires that he gets overtly publicly blackmailed as part of the plot. They could do it to him, but I have trouble him participating in such a plan. I also have trouble imagining that there aren't just guys in Iran who say "fuck it" and just get pissed off and say, my family got killed yesterday. Hit the desalination plants, right? And
that's great. Yeah.
And Israel will die of thirst, right? Yeah. Israel, 70%, 80% of their water comes from desalination. Israel will become an absolute killing field of a magnitude, that'll dwarf anything we've probably seen in our lifetime.
Yeah. I completely agree if that happens, and I personally believe it won't happen. But if it does, that's a complete disaster, a crime against humanity.
Yeah,
it is awful. But Israel is definitely meant to end up burdened with a lot of debt, an economy that no longer works, and strategically weakened at the end of this. I don't think they're meant to have a humanitarian crisis, but they are meant to be vassalized, I believe, into the GCC. While Iran is effectively vassalized into China. And then Trump is negotiating for the financial industrial complex.
But Israel's not going to sign off on this plan. Whoever's, right? This is going to be over Israel's dead body, right? Because Israel's taking a beat. I mean, anti-Semitism is really hitting new high watermarks, right? And I think Israel's paying a very, very high price for this war.
But Israel has always benefited from anti-Semitism.
Mild anti-Semitism.
Well, they want
true hatred doesn't go. It doesn't work as well, right?
On the military side, Israel to me was a jurisdiction where American military companies and the deep state can engage in their crimes against humanity. They turned Palestine into a laboratory where they could test the most illegal types of surveillance technologies and criminal technologies. And Israel was always the jurisdiction for doing that. The money would always float back to the US military companies, everything that was laundered through it. But it was always a tool for military powers. And if you want to recruit an army, they were involved in radicalizing the evangelical Christians by rewriting the Bible.
The Schofield Bible.
Schofield Bible.
Yeah.
They also were involved in ISIS and Al-Qaeda training camps that was funded via USAID. Elon Musk in the Department of Government Efficiency accidentally revealed that in 2024, $694 million went to ISIS training camps via USAID. And so ISIS was always an Israeli and US deep state proxy, and so is Al-Qaeda. And so if you want to recruit, their job was to radicalize the three faiths, make the Jews join the IDF in order to engage in the ethnic cleansing Greater Israel project. It was to fund and train via covert means with Saudi, Israel, and US, the Islamist terrorists. And it was also to radicalize the average American into thinking that they needed to protect Israel so that the Pentagon could continually push that budget over there. And they always had the justification for
That's failing. That one's failing.
Well, now the project is over because I believe that the financial industrial complex, which is the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, now have leverage and they're able to say, okay, China's got this game with Iran. We've got this game with the Western banks and BlackRock. Now we're in a situation where we demand regional stability. We'll give you one final war, eliminate the proxies. We don't want any more Iranian proxies in Lebanon or in Yemen or in Gaza. Saudi will not normalize until there is a Palestinian state. And Israel needs to be economically weakened and stop using it in order to agitate the region. And so a very dangerous last final war has, I believe, been set up to try and achieve that goal. And who's pulling the strings? Is China. And so this really comes down to, if you want to put it in its most simplest form, a negotiation between China, BlackRock, and JP Morgan. That's what I think this war is.
A lot of dead guys. I've always argued, the 9/11 story, there's people who have trouble grasping the idea that you could let that many people die. And I say, look, if you're in a position of great power, and, these are the same guys who had to drop guys to their death on Omaha Beach and Normandy and places like that if you can't make that call, you can't have that job. Now, I'm not condoning that call. What I'm saying is that the idea that you're going to lose 3,000 people means they wouldn't do it. That's highly flawed thinking. Those are the casualties of war.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, the best way to think about this is in terms of, you had the Dutch East India Company, you had the Dutch Central Bank, and you had a partnership between government and private corporate interest that would use the Dutch naval fleets in order to go get resources and engage in mercantilism and colonialism in order to build a colony. That then, they outsourced some of that cheap labor, and we had the British Empire. The British Empire did the same thing. You had the British East India Company, the private sector interest. You had the Bank of England, the money printing, and the government was the piggy bank. You bankrupt the government, and then you change the order. They then set up the games that made up the post-World War II empire. Wall Street effectively funded Nazi fascism. Wall Street effectively funded the Bolshevik Revolution that led to the creation of the Soviet Union. And Wall Street as well set up the Federal Reserve. And so you created in a game where you could profit from the Cold War. You could profit from these strategic tension narratives. And in the end, once America defaulted on its debt in 1971, when it wouldn't let anyone exchange the dollar for gold, as per the IMF agreement, we entered into this fiat currency debt-based Ponzi scheme where the goal was to simply bankrupt the US government, put all of the assets in private interest, which became a more decentralized British East India Company, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. You use the Federal Reserve System to basically end up with all the hard assets, burden the people with the debt, and then you reset the empire. The only difference here is
end up with a world war, just like we did to Germany, right? Post World War One.
But the difference here is that they don't control China and they don't control Russia.
Right.
And so now you have to negotiate with competing powers, which is why we're getting a multipolar world order, and kind of the traditional tools of hegemonic power now require a competing power that you don't control, that you have to negotiate with. So this 400-year experiment, starting from the Dutch to the American Empire, is now at the transition phase. And I believe that World War III is not an option because all these powers recognize that no one's
at least a traditional World War III.
Correct. So we need a stage, and this, I believe, to be the final stage, and that's what we're witnessing.
So here's what role does the psyche of Joe Sixpack come into play? So, for example, I just finished Jonathan Turley's book, Rage and the Republic. I like his books; they're very good. And he talks about the sort of street level chaos of post-revolutionary France, post-revolutionary America. It wasn't just they revolted and they took over. There was unbelievable chaos that was going on, and Joe Sixpack can make a difference when they get mad enough. And so you do have to worry about them sort of keeping them along, which is this whole wealth disparity debate that goes on, and we're at a top of a cycle, right? Or we're somewhere still near, but I think we're over the far side of the credit cycle, right? So I think we're not going to, rates are not going to go down from here. They're going to go up, and it's going to be multi-decade, I think, and that sort of thing. So it's downhill from here as I see it, and I think as you describe it, right? We're going to get operationally poor or less rich or whatever. You got a whole generation who have tremendous student debt and can't buy a house, and just all the things, and all the available women are trannies, and it just nothing's working, and we're at the top of the cycle. So what's the bottom look like? So let's say we do a Nikkei-like thing, which is an old school. It's just a price of an asset market. But nowadays, we really go into the valley of death, which is my metaphor. There's going to be a lot of grumpy people. I mean, are super grumpy because we're not starting euphoric. We're miles from euphoric. I call it the complacency bubble. I've used AI to try to figure out if that's an original concept, and AI gives me credit for it, so that's entertaining. But it seems to be like there's a bubble in everything, right? Private credit, private equity, normal equities, housing market, you name it. Everything is gone bloated. It seems to me when this lets loose, and private credit's already let loose, which means private equity is going to already let loose. As soon as Harvard started talking about lightening up on their alternative assets, you knew there was trouble. The minute Harvard mentioned it, right? Everyone should be rushing for the door. I think we're going to end up in a very grumpy phase. And I don't know how grumpy the populace can get before they start becoming a parameter to be considered seriously.
If you're a homeowner and you want more Bitcoin, Horizon just opened a whole new door. Most of your wealth is locked in your house, growing a few % per year, while Bitcoin has historically grown far faster. Horizon lets you convert a portion of your home's future value directly into Bitcoin without taking a loan. No monthly payments, no interest, no term limits. You stay in your home and you fully control and custody your Bitcoin. There's no forced liquidation, no margin calls, and no income requirement. You unlock tax-free cash today, and Horizon simply receives an agreed-upon share of your home's future appreciation when you sell or refinance. Hundreds of homeowners are already doing this in over 21 states. So, Go to joinhorizon.com and see your Bitcoin potential in about 90 seconds. Turn your home into a personal Bitcoin treasury with Horizon. If you're the kind of Bitcoiner who doesn't trust convenience, cloud backups, or leaving anything to chance, Dirty Man Safe was built for you. This underground physical storage is for the most paranoid self-custody setups, designed to protect and hide seed phrases, hardware, critical documents, and more. Rugged, weather-resistant, and built to disappear, Dirty Man Safe as a last-line fail-safe to your Bitcoin security model. Head to dirtymansafe.com and use code BTC Sessions for 10% off.
Yeah. Firstly, I don't think that's a global thing. I think
that's a local.
that's a local thing, yes.
Yeah.
So let's say the Western Hemisphere, Europe, America, Canada, that region. I said that they need war or they need to continue the strategic tension with Putin in Europe. Europe is vastly more impacted than America. But the wealth inequality is the thing. So the wealth is being concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And so after this war, I believe we do get some kind of deal, some kind of three-way victory. Everybody gets, maybe there's a Hollywood movie at the end of it, like the 12-Day War.
Yeah.
And Trump gets to bring it back. And, we get a weaker US, a weaker Iran, and a weaker Israel. That's what you need for regional stability in the Middle East. So that then happens. Initially from here, we are going to get significant inflation, and there will be supply chains that break, food insecurity. The World Economic Forum will further their agenda. They'll say, stay at home, don't use energy. They'll weaponize the whole thing to achieve their COVID-like goals of a technocracy. They will do that. But then we're going to hit the inflation, I believe, will take us to demand destruction that can only end in a recession and a big print.
Yep.
And so you have that big print, you have that recession, and I don't see any alternative to that after this. But then what are they going to do with the sheer level? So if America enters into a recession, the deficit to GDP ratio blows from like 7% to 15%.
Right.
Tax revenue goes down. Yields go up on the long term. The refinancing of debt becomes more and more distressed. And so what are they going to, well, they'll keep that alive for as long as they can, as long as people will use treasuries as collateral. Right now, they're kind of 40% of all the auctions, the treasury auctions, are being done in Cayman Island. And that's a basis trade where they're just trying to do 100-to-1 leverage trade by the hedgies in that disparity.
How much money are we talking about? What kind of total wealth in the Caymans is like 5 trillion or something? Is it bigger than that?
Yeah, no, I think it's about, so Japan's at 1.8 trillion. And I think Cayman's at about 2.5 trillion. I need to check that right now. Not quite 5 trillion. But it's based upon the Japan carry trade. So right now,
which started to crack.
Yeah,
the 30-year Japanese debt took off like a scalded dog upwards in terms of interest rate. It appears though Japan just basically flicked it in and said, we're done with this crap. We're going to let the interest rates go up.
Yeah.
There was about a week of disturbance in the markets. Then all of a sudden, everyone's gone up. Solve that problem. I go, you do not take the Japanese carry trade and wring it out of the system in 5 days.
Yeah.
So where is it right now? How's it hiding? Because that thing should be blowing the hell up.
Yeah, it was hidden by repo intervention, and they swift from QT to QE, but they didn't call it QE because they were buying short-term treasuries and bills.
Treasury buyback.
What year? Was that 2005?
That was about 50 billion has just happened over the last couple of months.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're
50
doing
50 billion's peanuts, though. 50 billion's peanuts.
Yeah. So there's issues in the private credit market. The repo market was the mechanism when they had, like, the Bank of Japan did that call where they wanted to, the Fed and the Bank of Japan put in a call to do a trade, and that kind of eased the markets a little bit. Weaken the dollar, strengthen the yuan, sorry. And so the Japanese yen, sorry.
I was gonna say I'm losing the plot here. I didn't realize how little I knew until you corrected that.
So the Japanese yen. So look, if Bank of Japan goes off on its own path, or it is a part of the Bank for International Settlements, and they're strategically trying to break the Japan carry trade, ease off the petrodollar, and break the euro dollar. Those are the three pillars. And then you've got Japan as the largest lender to the US government as a single foreign entity, other than Cayman, which is the hedgies. And then you've got Europe is actually larger than Japan and China combined right now when you come across all the countries. UK is the largest, but UK is the one that's going into severe stress right now.
Well, so is Germany. I mean, Germany's a total mess.
Absolutely.
But also this, to take the Hormuz problem back, Japan gets crushed if this goes on any longer than a few more days, is my understanding. Maybe they're already crushed. I'm still trying to figure out if it resolved today, how crushed various players are. And I think some of them are already in trouble.
And that's because they're dependent on LNG coming through, correct?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And what happened? We had a TACO where, in order to get the price of oil down, they relieved sanctions on Russia for oil on water and Iran.
We're bombing Iran while we're relieving sanctions, just to make sure we don't understand what's going on, right?
Yeah,
I thought that was incredibly telling. Now I know it's probably not the case, but I'm reminded of like there's nothing more permanent than like a temporary government solution. And that just really, I felt like showed their hand a little bit. Like, we're still going to attack you, but we can't have oil go up anymore. So,
well, starting in 2022, the Russians were selling Ukrainians oil.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
part of the reason is because the oil wasn't a parameter for the Russian military goal.
Didn't matter.
So it wasn't a choke point or anything. And so they didn't. So they say, yeah, sure, we'll sell it to you. And they will bomb the shit out of you and destroy whatever it is you do with it. But I was a massive Putin fan by the time I was done reading and writing about Ukraine war. I finally said, Putin's the only guy who's got his shit together in this world, best I can tell.
Putin and Xi Jinping are as smart as they get.
And Orban's no slouch. And I just like watching Maloney rip Macron's ass off. She just tears him a new one every chance she gets. She hates him.
But even
him and his father, or whatever he is, right?
Yeah. Even America buys enriched uranium from Russia for this nuclear program. So
we're probably buying the shit Hillary gave them.
By the way, just to close that loop though, but Japan is screwed, like Asia and Europe. So already, yeah.
Okay.
And they managed to do a deal with Iran, and they managed to get a shipment through for $2 million in order to get some of that unsanctioned oil from Iran. So what is happening now is Iran is renegotiating all of its agreements during this sanction relief, and we're kind of easing towards what the agreement looks like in the end. And now we're getting hints that of probably someone like BlackRock and China and Iran will provide security guarantees. Russia might provide some kind of enriched uranium stuff. But the agreement that was already negotiated, and prior to this war, Oman came out and said the framework for the deal is done. I personally believe the framework for the deal was done, and part of the negotiation was this war. And that's what we're witnessing right now. Then they go back to the table and continue the negotiations.
I used to think I had a chance of understanding something if I read enough about it. I'm now no longer convinced of this. I am convinced that markets have a way of punishing you when they get expensive. That's about that. I studied in chemistry. I studied solvation. This is you dissolve things up in solvent. One of the most famous solvent experts from the past. He said, "I've studied solvation for 40 years, and all I can say is that like dissolves like." and that's kind of where I'm at now. All I can say is I don't have a clue what's going on. It's just the 4D chess, and I'm still playing checkers. It's painful.
And I think that takes us to there is definitely that global game, and the big other power is the technical industrial complex. Like they, in an environment of civil unrest, they know how to weaponize civil unrest. And they're building the AI, the social credit scores, the programmable money, the stable coins, the pre-crime arrests. Palantir was doing genocide as a service in Gaza on subscription service. It was doing occupation as a service in West Bank. It was doing the integration with the drones in Ukraine. It's doing closed border, open border within America. It's doing the same across Europe. And all of those social media arrests that are happening based upon your social media and what you're about to say. Apple's buying a bunch of Israeli startups that predict what you're about to say to integrate it with AI so that we can effectively build the biggest police and surveillance state. And what gets rebuilt in Gaza is what they want to rebuild for everybody. That's happening.
I got in an argument this weekend with a bunch of guys where there was some video that we also face this, is that even real question? And everyone gave me shit. They said, that's so obviously AI. And I go, well, when I first asked Grok, is that AI? Grok said no. And then other people asked Grok, is that AI? And Grok said yes. I'm going, we're getting different answers. Grok is lying his ass off to us here, right?
Yeah.
And if you try to pin it down on something having to do with Israel, forget it. Grok does not like questions about Israel. I still think Israel's paying a price, and I don't want to sound anti-Semitic, but the Jews in the country aren't going to like this. It is a powerful lobby. These guys are not going to fall on their sword for some grand scheme of things. I don't think. I think they're pretty dedicated. I mean, I don't think there's anyone more dedicated to a cause than the Jewish culture is to the existence of Israel and things like that. We don't have the level of passion they have, right? So it seems to me that the model's got to include Israel not taking a beating.
I do agree that is the hardest part of this mission. But I think that there will be regime change within Israel. I think Netanyahu has negotiated his exit.
Is he alive officially now?
Well, that's the question, right?
Well, I saw something yesterday that made it sound like they said, look, we've got 20 different camera angles on this particular thing he just did.
Yeah.
The claim was that there's no way they AI'd all those camera angles. I'm thinking, well, maybe, who knows, right?
That's the problem, right? We're in an era where we don't know what to believe anymore, and that's only going to get worse and worse and worse. Like we're entering into that phase where we can't. We've spent the last couple of weeks trying to figure out whether Netanyahu's alive or not, based upon all sorts of stuff.
And if he's alive, he's making no effort whatsoever to show that it's true.
Yeah,
right. Because he could. He flat out could if he wanted to.
Here's my thought on Israel, and it's an unpopular opinion because people think Israel rules the world.
Really? An opinion on Israel that's unpopular? What are the odds? Holy Simon, you've undoubt my expectations.
So look, most people think Israel rules the world and that's the top of the chain. Israel as a jurisdiction gets wrecked by the fall of anything that happens in America. They don't suddenly end up like the world empire with Pax Judaica.
Oh, I don't think that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't support that model, but I don't think they're going to give up positions of strength that they have just because it's part of some grand plan.
Yeah, my personal opinion is the worst thing that ever happened to Jewish people is Israel, and they just use it to recruit an army, and they depend on anti-Semitism to radicalize people in order to use them to engage in inhumane things across the Middle East. I think there will be a change to a leftist, what happened on October the 7th, tell us the truth, why did you let that happen?
That would be fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
A little October 7th fessing up would go a long ways.
Yeah, so then I think you get a leftist throw Netanyahu under the bus, and Israel stops being used by the military for these covert operations, and China holds the whole thing together in the Middle East with the Gulf countries, Iran, and the strategic tension, the constant manufacturing of war by the US deep state and military, the whole Mossad, MI6, CIA stuff. I think they're negotiating their compensation for whoever is the real power within Israel, because Netanyahu is just a puppet, I personally think. He works for greater power.
Yeah, I wouldn't underwrite his insurance policy, forgetting about whether there was a clause there saying the Iranians could kill him. I think he's at risk from a lot of directions. Could Israel survive as a nation, as a pacifist nation?
I personally believe it can, but I think it will be acquired in distress bit by bit. I think it's doing its partnerships with India and UAE, and they are being penetrated by the financial industrial complex. And so I think the financial industrial complex is effectively looking to acquire many of the assets, privatize them, strip them out, and leave Israel with no national power, and control it through strategic acquisitions. And I think Abraham Accords, UAE, that was the mechanism for basically having a good cop, bad cop relationship where Saudi looks great, but UAE looks like the enemy and the cop. But I think in this operation, UAE is going to become, a strategically acquired financial center, and Israel is going to be more and more privatized. And just like America in the West, it will be controlled by BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and those types
so
of.
Become the Caymans of the other hemisphere.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, we've taken out every enemy at that point as well, too, right? There's no threat anymore around them.
Oh, sorry, Nathan.
I was just saying. I was just thinking about if you can blame basically a lot of it on the Likud party and Netanyahu, and you've taken out the hardliners and the IRGC. And there's basically, and maybe we have a 2-state solution or something with Palestine. There's no really looming threat to Israel anymore. So I don't think that narrative is necessary. So I think it could.
Well, the right way to frame that is there's no justification for Israel being being used by the military at that stage.
Yes.
And their whole reason for existence was to recruit Jews to join the army, to weaponize them, to test weapons in the Palestinian laboratory, and the justification around that. And if there is no longer a threat that they quote unquote are saying they're always trying to get us, then the need for Israel is the change we're witnessing right now.
But there is some deep-seated tribalism that goes so far back that I wouldn't underestimate the desire of some percentage of the population of Israel's neighbors to just want to just wipe them out. My wife ran around Morocco for a year, and she ran into people who hated Jews who had never met one, and it was so sort of deep seated in the culture of some of the people that and this idea that Israel is no longer a threat. I could imagine some of the countries surrounding it would say, yeah, right now, but if we stomp them out, then they won't ever be a threat again. Yeah. And I that wouldn't shock me if that was the plan, saying, look, we can't let them up now.
Yeah, but nukes, as long as they hang on to those.
Well, that's a problem. That is a problem.
Yeah, I think they'll get left alone.
Well, except I'm not sure the Arab states worry much about the nukes as we do, right? I mean, it's the other thought I have, by the way, is if Israel, by virtue of its actions against Iran, let's pretend like it's that simple, causes a global catastrophe of, energy shortages and deep global recessions and things like that, I could imagine Iran declaring that a very big win, because they'll say, look, next time Israel says they're going to come bomb us, every other country in the world is going to mug them and say, no, you're not going to bomb them, because the last time you did, you made us all suffer. So put the gun back in the holster, leave Iran alone, because that didn't work out well. Because I think Iran has surprised some people on some topics, right?
I think so. And I
don't think it should have. I don't think it should have. It should not have been a surprise.
There is a rebranding of Iran that's happening, because obviously Israel and America were the aggressor in this situation. So they have been branded as the defender that is fighting, for their survival, which is a rebranding of, the head of the snake and the terrorist that's causing all the problems. So they are definitely getting that rebranding.
They're getting the victim trump card. They're getting the victim trump card.
I think it's important to say that Iran does have the second largest population of Jews in the Middle East. So they've never had a problem with Jews.
And 98% literacy rate. You know, an interesting experiment is you go on YouTube and you search streets of Tehran and you watch the videos. Now, they look like they're put together by the Chamber of Commerce to me, right? These do not look like just some guy walking around the streets. The whole thing looks very well orchestrated. But it looks like New York City. It looks like a Western world, blue jeans, no face coverings, good looking food. Everyone looks happy as a clam. And the very fact, let's say it is a Chamber of Commerce of Iran output. There's a bunch of them and they all look similar. It shows you that Iran is attempting to sell itself in that representation, which means they're trying to meet the Western world and say, look, we are you. Don't do this to us.
Well, Iran has always wanted to trade with the West. They've had no problem with that. This has been a manufactured war by military operations to ensure. I mean, an unsanctioned Iran and an unsanctioned Syria that is allowed to do what it always wanted to do is two of the highest growth cultural, like just the tourism, the resources, the location. If there was unification, there was a degree of regional stability in the Middle East. That's what America never wanted to happen. And if it's
so I actually tried to find out if there's a way that an American could sneak investments into Iran. I had a British money managing friend. I was trying to figure out, can you buy them for me?
Well, this is where the ETF conversation comes through.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
BlackRock will be managing the capital flows via ETFs into these countries, and it wants the US military to open some of them up in this transition so it can leave America as a nation state and just focus on America as capital markets. And that's where I think we're having. I think the nation state in the West is fully financialized, securitized, and controlled by transnational capital. And they're trying to get a foothold in these new areas, because they know that the jig is up and the birth rates are absolutely diabolical.
We're like 1.5 now or something.
Yeah, something is catastrophic. And they know that the labor is in Africa and the Middle East. China has its end. It won't be able to reverse its demographic issues, so that will become issue later. But also we've got this AI and robotic trade where the utility of humans is becoming less and less. And China has the infrastructure to utilize renewable energy and new forms of energy that makes the oil trade disrupted. So we have a lot of craziness ahead of us.
I'm less convinced that the alternative energies can battle oil. I try to get at the question of, are these alternative energies really a threat to the fossil fuel? And I've not been able to convince myself of that. Their return EROIEA, whatever, the return on energy seems too thin.
I agree, but I don't underestimate China's desire to become oil and gas independent.
Well, nukes. This is why I own some nuke investments, and again, handcuffed as an investor. I have such a deep-seated faith that the markets are way overvalued, and once they start going down, every boat sinks, right? You don't sit there and make money on Philip Morris while Nvidia is tanking 50, 60, 70%. They all go down.
Yeah. Let's play that out just a little bit, because Simon, with your view, if we get this deal coming up here in April, we're shifting to that multipolar world. It would seem to me that there's basically capital moving away from the US, and it's going to be going to these emerging markets and kind of elsewhere in the world if the financial industrial complex gets its way here. So I would think that would mean that, like, U.S. bonds are going down in price, up in yield. U.S. equities are going down in price as well too. Are we going to have, basically, if Dave is right about being well over historical averages, are we looking at potentially then having some sort of financial crisis in the U.S. markets? Or no, like it's going to be a managed transition? I don't necessarily see that sort of thing happening. I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of the markets right now, how you think it's going to play out, particularly looking at precious metals, their recent moves, and then also your thoughts on Bitcoin, how this fares during this whole phase.
Yeah, I do think that the FIC want a managed transition, but doesn't mean they can achieve it.
Fair.
And so as long as US treasuries are able to be rolled over and they are used as acceptable collateral for the financial system, then they'll just try and extract as much wealth in this K-shaped economy as they can. Now, I think they want to utilize the dollar for as long as they can. I think they like that monopoly, but I also think they see massive opportunity in connecting all the different rails, and the fact that there is, financial rails in China that they can't control. And so it's a recognition that there is more money in building, rather than one US military base, what if they build military bases everywhere? What if they could try and get a foothold in connecting financial rails across multiple financial systems? So I think they're hedging that. And the way they manage that is through ETF flows and through currency flows, make sure foreign currencies outperform the dollar, but keep the dollar going for as long as they can. And foreign stock markets outperform the S&P, but keep the S&P going for as long as they can. But if you enter into a recession, you can't defy this gravity. The cost, the growth, if the growth rate is not above the average cost on the debt, and we enter into a recession, then to me, there's nothing but, you can't stop that correction unless you can stop it with money printing. But I think we enter a breakaway point where the jig is up.
And historically, when the money printing starts, the assets start looking like lousy investments. So if the 70s being the model, equities were a bad return on investment because of inflation. So if you somehow everyone thinks, oh, I'm going to get rich because they're going to cause inflation, my assets are going to go up in price. I go, no, you're not. I guarantee you don't get rich with inflation. you just, especially big inflation, you might get rich with a little tiny bit of inflation where no one's noticing, but you're not going to get rich. And here, a stat that has just boggled my mind from 1981 to the present, which is a half a century essentially, the valuation of the market, not the price, the valuation, which should not trend, is up, compounded 4% a year for 45 years. 4%. What happens when it compounds negative 4% for 45 years?
Wild.
That's just going to be ugly. It's just going to be unbelievably ugly.
Absolutely. I think the Bitcoin story, Nathan, let me tell you what's happening right now in Dubai. So in Dubai, there is a massive transfer from retail assets to institutional at deep discounts in distress. But also, their gold started trading at a discount, $30 to $50 discount to spot within Dubai. So those that wanted to leave Dubai and bring their gold with them, because it's the largest gold market in the world, they couldn't, because you can't land in UK. If you fled UK because of their draconian tax structure and immigration issue, you ended up in Dubai. And if you were taxed on your worldwide wealth and now you're thinking of going back to UK, you got an issue. And so what started to happen is the war kicked off the bull market in Bitcoin to a small degree. Gold had that big correction and sell-off because I believe that the market knows this isn't catastrophe. If the market thought this was catastrophe, I think gold and oil would be going up together. That didn't happen. But the correction, I believe in Dubai, they started selling their gold, rotating it into Bitcoin, so that they could then go on the plane and leave. So at the end of this becomes a self-custody story. And the Bitcoin story has always been a self-custody story. Gold in your hand or Bitcoin in a hardware wallet. And you can flee any country, go anywhere and scale your wealth that way. Now, we have had many, many talks about force majeures and derivatives contracts that can't be fulfilled by the underlying asset. We're seeing that in silver. We're seeing that in gold. We're seeing that in oil. We're seeing that in many different commodities right now. And eventually you realize that you don't own your stocks. You don't own your bank deposit. You don't own your bonds. You don't own your gold in custody. You don't own your silver in custody. And to me, the Bitcoin story becomes when people realize they don't actually own their assets and they can't hold gold at scale in their own pocket. And that's where I think it becomes a real story. So I'm buying into weakness. I think Bitcoin has a great future in a multipolar world, but right now it's still connected as a NASDAQ high risk asset. So I'm accumulating.
Well, so that's one of the things I noticed. I think Nathan, we talked about this when Simon didn't show up on Friday. Unlike Dave, who waited till Monday not to show up on time.
So I put a pager in my laptop. It blew up.
Yeah, I know. We sent him a golden pager. But Bitcoin was tracking the NASDAQ, which really should have had the Bitcoin guys crawling, skin crawling. And I talked to Marty a couple times about it. I said, Marty, Bitcoin's tracking the NASDAQ. That is a problem, in my opinion. And so I've got a number of tweets out there where I said I'm down today, but the good news is that I'm not tracking the markets. And well, I don't. If your portfolio is tracking the markets, you're going to pay at some point, in my opinion. Yep. You do not want to be there when the correlation goes to 1, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Agreed.
But I do think in this changing market, Bitcoin becomes a tool in a multipolar world that becomes a vital part of these currency wars. I think self-custody is a very, very important use case. And I think it will break the correlation between a high AI stock. Maybe not in this round. Maybe this is another cycle of purchases. But right now, you can't, I believe, gold is definitely overvalued at this level but I do think there's a bigger story here. And I do think you can't have enough gold and enough Bitcoin into this if you've got a long-term dollar cost average. I don't think anyone can time the markets right now. It's 100% geopolitical.
Yep.
So when you say gold is overvalued, I'm going to see if I can get a clarification on that.
I was going to say it's currently 4,397.
But I don't know if there is not a price to me that represents fair value for gold. If gold's overvalued, it sounds like a momentum statement. That is, it's overbought. It's over, the enthusiasm's too high, something like that. But if gold went to 40,000, I'd say okay. The guys who say there's not enough gold to back the currencies, I go, not at these prices.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I do believe that gold is world reserve asset, and as treasury is less useful as world reserve asset. If the currency is being weakened, then everyone goes to gold. So I think the future, the next 10 years, the demand for gold only goes up, and that only can be reflected in price.
Right. And to show you how nuts the markets are, I noticed that gold is down about 2%, silver is up about 2%, and the XAU is up about 3%, with gold down about 2%. And I'm going, okay, so there is some fair trade unwinding here or something. I don't know, but you would think the XAU might track gold a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But it's not today, and it's been a couple of weeks of. Now, someone made the argument that gold is collateral being liquidated because of. They made the argument that if you've got some boatload of oil that's not moving through the strait, that to cover your costs, I can't remember. They referred to it as shorting a tanker full of oil. I think it was Doomberg who made this argument. Something about shorting a tanker full of oil, you need to sell something to cover this problem. And as a consequence, they're selling gold. I don't know how to process that information besides just acknowledge that I think Doomberg's a smart bastard. And what I don't know, here's a question for you, Simon. Doomberg's base case for energy is that it is operationally unlimited, right? Not to say that it's ever unlimited, because it is a sphere that we live on, but he says, for all intents and purposes, it's unlimited. And that's a relative minority view, in my opinion. Where do you come down on that?
Sounds pretty interesting. I think there is the whole peak oil concept has become unproven. It's just
it hasn't held up for the last 20 years. Yes,
exactly.
Yep.
But yeah, I do think we're going to get technological innovation in terms of the energy play, and I do think that the price of energy just verges down. This is the demand on the demand side. There is just, if this AI trade, if you crash the price of oil, you get the energy down, you do a deal. Then, last time we went from like $147 to $35 with Brent crude, I think, from memory. I think
negative 34 for one of the oil prices, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so look, there's no choice but to crash the price of oil. And that's what is going to determine the outcome of this right now in the time frame. There's only two things which I think whoever's in charge is looking at: the 10-year treasury and the price of oil. And you need both to go down. And the only way to get those down is to return to where we were before this Iran war.
But what you can crash the price of oil, but you can't print oil. And so you end up in this scenario where you say, look, I totally concur. I read every peak oil book. I could lip sync them 25 years ago, which, by the way, made me a fortune, because from January 1st of 2000 to December 31st of 2009, because I was a gold bug, oil bug, inflation hawk, and I even had some short positions in there at the right time, which I'll never do again. I compounded 13%, which was by far my best decade when graded on a curve, right? No one was getting 13% a year that decade. But it seems to me that we're having to dig deeper and weirder to get the oil that we want. And somehow that tells me we're and I remember all the Matt Simmons, the water cuts coming out of Gawar and are getting higher and higher and higher. It seems to me it's like squeezing water out of a sponge metaphor. At some point, you're applying vast amounts of pressure to squeeze the water out of the sponge. And I also would add, I'm not convinced that our energy independent due to shale oil was profitable. I think it might have been a subsidized. Someone said, "Get me the goddamn oil. I don't care what it costs." And so we gave them cheap credit. They were able to leverage their ass off. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much money was really made. Sort of net profit, or how much of it was based on a credit bubble. To get the energy out of the oil sands. Do you have an opinion on that one?
It sounds very logical to me. I'm listening through it right now. I haven't got anything too intelligent to say about it, but I think what is interesting is I don't know if you saw throughout this war that COMEX came out and said that in the FT that the US government should stop manipulating the price of oil. I think the U.S. Treasury have taken on a ginormous short oil position, and I think they're managing something right now. But I do think. But
you have to cover that at some point.
Exactly, which means that they have to reach a deal and then they have to cover it. And how are they going to?
And that same argument was used for driving the price of gold down. Shorts driving the price, but at some point the squeeze appears.
Exactly. And so if they're on the wrong side of a squeeze, I think it's catastrophic. But if they can cover it at a lower price by signing a deal, I think it's 100% market manipulation.
So do you think we'll still be pumping a lot of oil out of the ground in 50 years?
I think so. I think so.
Okay. I'll take the other side of the bet just to make it interesting. And by the way, I'll be dead before I have to pay up.
Yeah. But I do think the other side of all these contracts, I think there is a structural fraudulent nature of many of these force majeures and not being able to take delivery. We're definitely going to see something, and that's why I kind of turn back to that. If you can't hold the gold in your hands, you can't trust the custodian, and if you can't trust the custodian, the only asset I know that I can cryptographically and mathematically prove that I own and do it at scale and go anywhere is Bitcoin in self-custody, where I can verify my own transactions with nodes. And I think there is tremendous utility in that as this story unfolds.
So it does. This all reminds me of The Big Short.
Yes.
I, by the way, did write about the coming subprime crisis precisely on May 6, 2002. And you say, well, you're too early. I go, if you predict the collapse of the banking system, 5 years is pretty good. Right?
It's not bad. It's pretty good.
If I predict the Dow's going to drop 1,000 points, 5 years too early is no good. But if you really predict Armageddon, 5 years is an error bar of spot on. But they just declared that there was not a problem, right? When they were trying to cash in their credit default swaps and stuff, they just said, no, we don't. What are you talking about, right? They did duck feet, right? Duck feet, and said we don't see a problem here. And I remember watching that play out and going, they're just denying the fact that there's a crisis. They're just declaring there's not a crisis.
And it was the biggest transfer of wealth, and we create these behemoth financial institutions that control our governments, all lobbies, and I think are greater powers and have no oversight at the moment. Really, they got regulatory capture, they've got government capture, and they've turned the world into collateralized debt obligations.
I know. CPDOs and squareds and cubes and Jesus, none of this is worth a shit. None of this creates wealth. Robert Gordon's book, which I always recommend about wealth creation, is really a must-read. It's really a brilliant treatise on what actually is wealth creation. And moving money around is not wealth creation; it's a tax. Boomers' healthcare should not be in the GDP. We're depreciating assets.
Yeah.
Right. If you had a Corvair that was in the shop each week, are you better off? No. Right. It's a depreciating asset. And so the way you can tell it is if, it's like, I got in an argument with a Berkeley professor, an economist, and I said the Depression lasted till after World War II. And, I made some argument about rationing and stuff like that. And he said, no, but the GDP shows that the GDP grew, 5% a year for the 5 years of the war, whatever. And I thought about it. About 10 years later, I went at him and pointed out that there should be a depreciation rate built into GDP. So if you make a bomb and then you drop it and it becomes worthless, that's different than if you make a bulldozer, right? Yep. If you build a factory, so our GDP during World War II was completely, and it was debt based. And debt
broken window fallacy on like an international level. It's the broken window fallacy.
It's the broken boomer fallacy when it comes to healthcare. I like that one. So you really have to. We got to get back to this question of what's wealth, and AI is potentially wealth, but it's also what I fear about AI, besides authoritarianism, is the fact that it's going to cause creative destruction, which is fundamental to capitalism, contrary to what a lot of people seem to think. But if it happens too quickly, right? If you go through too many cycles too quickly, each generation has to pay for itself, or you go broke. And people say, well, that's not true. And I go, well, try bulldozing your house every 5 years and building a better one. Tell me how that works out for you, right? No, you have to get a certain amount of usage out of something before you creatively destroy it, or you're going through too many generations too quickly. And AI is going to do that. I think it's going to break the system because it's going to cause change it's future shock. It'll come too fast to process.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's also an interesting one where the models between, I believe that China is developing AI because it wants productivity increase to use it for its manufacturing base, and it has the demographic issue, so it's trying to solve a real problem, and so it's government subsidized. Whereas American model is obviously it's private, And so they're trying to figure out how to monetize AI, which guarantees that they lose the race.
Right.
Although the innovation is a lot faster in America, but trying to figure out how to monetize it and how you justify the capital markets is the issue, because China's just actually trying to use it to make everything more efficient to get further ahead. And I think that becomes a thing. And the other side is the silver part. I still don't know who's on the wrong side of the silver trade from that crazy, those crazy events. And, we're I still don't know who's on the wrong side. We haven't seen who was on the wrong side of that trade yet.
So which corpse is floating to the surface? And they talk about how, so-and-so is hedged. And I go, someone had to hold the hedge. Right. Yeah. So when China's hedge, or when Qatar's hedge, or whatever, these hedges, I remember when Citigroup in 2007 or something said we're fully hedged. And my response was, what, by the Klingon Empire? Yeah. I mean, who can hold Citigroup's hedge?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the answer is the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. They're hedged by socializing losses and privatizing gains, which
that's
is
exactly right.
And that's where
it doesn't create wealth. It ultimately makes us poorer. That's the problem. Yeah, you have to think in widgets or something. There's digital widgets, I get it, but they still have to be widgets.
Yeah, true. And even if Elon Musk is allowed to acquire X, by borrowing against his stock, and then he has to give a backdoor to the NSA in Israel for digital ID, and then they're probably building a social credit score. Is that real net worth, or is that a financialized and securitized subordination and blackmail operation?
We're selling them the rope to hang us.
Exactly.
I think it's possible that the day the internet went live, guaranteed authoritarianism. I think it's possible that was like the day they split an atom. That guaranteed that we'd end up with a very risky nuclear world. Now, I don't know if we're going to blow ourselves up with it. Did you read Annie Jacobs's nuclear war?
That's been on my reading list, but
it's a little horrifying. So she basically interviewed all these prominent guys in the whole nuclear military industrial complex, and she puts together basically a chronological scenario from the first microsecond, which was a flash out of North Korea, and tracks it second by second and minute by minute. And she says, the president's now going to be getting on Air Force One. So it's like the movie, like the show 24.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. And so she tracks it, and her conclusion is 78 minutes later, the world has been destroyed.
Yeah.
Wow.
And from one flash out of North Korea.
Yeah.
Because of the protocols. Now, here's the problem with the mutually assured destruction. It appears as though, as stated, our protocols say it's not a judgment call. When this happens, you must do this, and that's what causes it to spin out of control. The problem I have is that for you to be convincing, you have to convey that you believe that, even if down deep in the bowels of the deep state, they go, but we could never do that. They can't let us know that.
Wasn't there a Russian sub that there was like a miscommunication?
Some guy called it. He said, I'm not doing it.
He's like, I'm not doing it.
Yep.
Could have been doomsday all over at that point in time. So a couple things I do want to touch on, and then we'll move to close out a little bit, is one, Simon, if you're wrong about your thesis, what evidence, what would you expect to see to lead you to go like, okay, this is not what's happening, we've gone in a different direction, or even kind of similarly that the military industrial complex is winning in this situation and take us? Is it just boots on the ground, or is there something else that we should be alert for? And then Dave, for you, especially with the moving precious metals, if we have what currently in markets has your attention, what would be a signal that maybe that great overvaluation is going to correct? And Simon, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, good question. So if we don't get a deal before the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump, then I think the analysis is wrong.
Okay. So set my watch here.
Yeah.
When is that meeting?
it's meant to be April, but then there's been questions around, is it delayed? Is it not delayed? So
yeah, they'll delay it if they don't get a deal. So
yeah. And so, yeah, if there is a deal and then Xi Jinping and Trump meet, then I think the analysis was right. If this escalates to the point where there's boots on the ground, they try and take over Iran and they price the oil in dollars, there's a forever war, and Israel gets more and more aggressive, then the military-industrial complex beat out the financial-industrial complex.
But the boots on the ground isn't even required, right? It's just if there's an escalation of the destruction of capital, right?
With the desalination, if Iran or somebody else takes out the desalination facilities, would that be a sufficient escalation to go, okay, we're stuck here?
Yeah, if someone blows something up that creates a humanitarian crisis that leads to like the death of civilians in the Gulf states or something like that, then we're off track.
It means the rules changed.
Yeah,
it means the rules changed.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. That makes sense to me. And then Dave, your thoughts on currently, like, it feels a little tense out there. Your thoughts on the market, what to watch for, and what might be a sign that we've actually entered this correction phase?
Well, ironically, I've stated many, many times over the years, I don't think geopolitical events are anywhere near as much of a trigger for financial markets as people think. So if you look at the history, World War I starts and the markets get a little jittery and then they seem to be okay. And so geopolitical events tend to not, I think, rattle markets as much as people think they do. This one could be an exception since it's geopolitical into the heart of what the entire free market is, and that is run on energy, right? I don't know, Simon, do you think we're already going to see starvation because of the restricted fertilizer production, things like that? Do you think we're already committed to some level of famine?
I think from what I can tell, India had enough strategic reserves to make this year's crop. But there's going to be in Bangladesh energy issues. So I think there'll be food supply chain issues, but I don't think we're going to see like that level of.
So third world. So the markets, the thing that's got my attention is I'm confident, almost positive at this point, that the credit markets are now fractured. They're fracturing. So I think they put away the regional bank crisis pretty effectively, but surprised me. I don't think you lose three big regional banks and all of a sudden just button the whole thing down. I think they got lucky. I think the private credit market followed by private equity, which has a Venn diagram that looks something like that, and the exit. People trying to get out of their alternative assets where they're 40% of retirement accounts are alternative assets. I think that problem has already started and is ripping along, and the only thing that's stopping it from becoming a crisis is the gating.
Yeah,
which is operationally like saying the only thing to stop the bank run is they close the banks. And so I believe that no one who knowingly in a sophisticated way owns private credit is doing anything but trying to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And as a consequence, I think the private credit market game is over. The quantity of money committed to private credit is very hard to get since it's unregulated, and the word private is probably synonymous with fraud. And then you got private equity, astonishing number. There are more private equities than McDonald's.
What?
Yep. There's 19,000 private equities supposedly.
Holy crap!
And so it's a cottage industry of morons, right? Yeah. It's just and each one's doing bad things behind closed doors and not marking to market. And so I would say that there are many trillions of dollars that are hard to know how many that are at great risk now of that they're trying to unravel, and the only thing that's stopping them are the rules.
Yeah.
Income
Trump, you can dump it on the pensioners in the 401k.
Well, and that's not going to work. I don't think. I think that's going to become too obviously. That's too obvious. That's a humanitarian crimes against humanity, right? If my money manager lost my money because they did that, I'd put a bullet in his forehead, right? That's inexcusable. irresponsible behavior to put 401ks into private equity. Just absolutely irresponsible. They probably already have, because I have TIAA money, and they probably are dumping that into private equity. But I can get my TIAA, the account I have is not gated. There's two kinds of TIAs. One is the one that Cornell puts in that I can get it out over 10 years. Back in the late 90s, I said, I don't like that, and I rolled it out over 10 years, while simultaneously putting it in my supplemental retirement account where I can get it out with a phone call.
Yeah.
So my TIA money, when I say, holy shit, I think these guys are going to break the buck inside this account, I'll just send it over to Fidelity into a treasury money market, hope those guys survive. So I think that's the problem. I think it's already showing. When the real estate market rolled over in 2006 quietly, the market ABX derivatives index started drifting away from par in either late 06, 07. I told my class in March of 07 that the banking system was about to collapse. And then I had the same group in 09 as seniors. These were sophomores. They were now seniors. And I said, did I tell you the banking system was going to collapse? They go, yeah, it was February of 09, right? So it was just heads on fire. And I said, did your econ professors tell you that? And they said, no. And I said, what are those assholes paid for, right? And my first guest lecture for chemistry honors, right? A chemistry honors sequence. My first guest lecture was the former CEO of Morgan Stanley Bank, of Morgan Stanley Bank, who I happen to have a connection to. And he came in, 2-hour talk to the class. He says, which you guys are planning on going to med school? This is in February 09. And some hands went up. He said, good luck getting a loan. And they all said, whoa. Now I asked him a question. This guy cut his teeth on mortgage-backed securities and then became CEO of the bank, the banking subsidiary of Morgan Stanley. So this guy said, in this talk, he talked about having some $900 million or billion, I don't know what the number was, probably million at that point, an account which was backed by some quantity of money. And I go, wait a minute, that's a 2 million-fold leverage you've got brewing there. I did some quick math. He said, yeah, it was backed by nothing. It was just pure leverage. And they said, and then I looked up and everyone was doing it. And then he left in 06. He was retired in 06. And I asked him a question at the depths. I said, New York 10 years from now, is it distant memory, or does it look like Detroit? And he says it looks like Detroit. So he got it wrong. Yep. He saw them not able to fix the system. And they somehow fixed it. I think Wall Street showed evidence that they didn't think they could fix the system when they paid themselves huge bonuses. I think they basically said, look, we just got all this bailout money. The game's over. Pay now or never get another paycheck. So we're going to take the money. And then they looked up a year or two later, said, holy shit, we're still in the game. I don't think it's going to work again. I think that's going to fail. So I think we've started.
Yeah, I think they'll hedge globally and adjust to a multipolar world and get more powerful.
That's right. The hedge will be in some other continent somewhere, yes. But we're going to go into the valley of death before we come out. We can't back out of this one. And by the way, I see famous guys quoting unfunded liabilities. And I see people quoting 60 billion. I go, not even close. I saw someone the other day who was a smart guy quote 100 billion. I've seen the Treasury report that quotes 175 billion. Trillion. 175 trillion. Larry Kolikoff, who's the world's expert, puts it at 250.
Wow.
So it's like 3 or 4 million per taxpayer of unfunded liabilities. These are liabilities that we promise, and if you project revenues forward, you still don't know how you're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
These are the IOUs that your revenues can't account for. 4 million per taxpayer, something like that. We've got half our population is not working. Half of our population is not working.
Yeah.
It seems like no matter what we do, the game is over.
Or it's going to reset.
Yep.
But you shake the Etch-a-Sketch and move on. You just start over. You dust yourself off. But I think Joe Sixpack's going to be pissed off. And I don't think the boomers can get out of this one. I don't think the boomers, they're McMansions. Who's going to buy their McMansion?
Oh no, they're going back to multi-generational households. Like
I think so.
I think the boomers' wealth is all on paper, and it's getting written down by 50% pretty quick. Because there's no one to buy it. There's just no one to buy it.
There's so many assets there's no one to buy it. There's so many assets that there's no one to buy.
Simon, any final thoughts?
I think we had a great conversation. I think we should come back and do another one and see how we got on.
See who is full of shit.
Let's check back and see how we did.
I think we agreed on almost everything, really.
I think it did, yeah. I think it was a wonderful kind of, I think Simon added some more color kind of to his worldview of how we're kind of moving and what forces are driving the conflict in Iran. But I think it's largely agreement.
Right.
That's boring, isn't it? What can we disagree on?
Well, I think I believe in chaos theory more. So you have more of a kind of a Luongo model where this happens. I'm more like, Jackson Pollock, a believer that nothing happens according to plan because no one can plan for the shit that's coming our way.
When I first got into Bitcoin, I was overwhelmed. The jargon, the security risks, the fear that one mistake could cost everything. I remember staring at my screen and wondering, are my keys safe? Did I do this right? That experience is why I started BTC Sessions. For over a decade, this channel has helped millions of people like you learn how to use and secure Bitcoin. But I realized something. For many people, videos aren't enough. Everyone learns differently. Some need to ask questions in real time as an expert walks through their setup, their goals, and their threat model. And certain things like advanced cold storage, inheritance planning, privacy, and node or mining setups often can't be fully solved by watching another tutorial. So I built BTC Mentor. I recruited the best Bitcoin educators on the planet to work with you one-on-one. Real experts, real answers, personalized hands-on guidance tailored to your exact situation. Whether you're brand new or building a complex setup, we meet you where you're at and walk with you step by step. By the end, you don't just hope your Bitcoin is safe, you know it is. If you're ready for that level of confidence, then head to btcmentor.io and book a call with us today.
If you enjoyed this episode with Simon Dixon and David Collum, please do like and subscribe. It really does help us out. And check out the previous episode with either of these two wonderful guests.